Welcome to our video on the top 10 most racist countries in the world in 2024. In this video, we'll dive into the places where racial discrimination, xenophobia, and ethnic tensions are most prevalent today. From systemic oppression to social exclusion, these countries struggle with deep-rooted issues that affect millions of people based on their race, ethnicity, or nationality. Whether you're looking to understand global racism or raise awareness about these critical issues, this video will provide a comprehensive overview of the countries where racism is most pervasive in 2024. 10. Italy. Italy has seen a rise in racism and xenophobia, particularly against immigrants from Africa, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. The influx of migrants and refugees over the past decade has fueled anti-immigrant sentiment, leading to the growth of far-right political movements that capitalize on fears about immigration. These sentiments often manifest in discriminatory policies, hate crimes, and social exclusion. African immigrants in particular face high levels of unemployment, exploitation, and racial violence. The situation is exacerbated by Italy's economic struggles, which have been used to justify anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies. Despite efforts by civil society groups to combat racism, Italy remains a challenging environment for ethnic minorities and immigrants in 2024. 9. Israel. Israel's complex social fabric is marked by significant racial and ethnic tensions, particularly between Jewish Israelis and Arab Palestinians. The treatment of Palestinians in the occupied territories has drawn widespread criticism, with accusations of apartheid practices due to the segregation and unequal rights between Jewish settlers and Palestinian residents. Additionally, Ethiopian Jews in Israel face systemic discrimination, including in education, employment, and housing, leading to protests against racism within the Jewish community. African asylum seekers, primarily from Sudan and Eritrea, also experience harsh treatment, including detention and deportation, fueled by xenophobic rhetoric. While Israel continues to navigate its complex identity and security concerns, racial and ethnic discrimination remains a significant challenge in 2024. 8. Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, racism manifests in the treatment of foreign workers, particularly those from South Asia and Africa. These workers, who make up a large part of the labor force, often face severe exploitation and abuse under the country's kafala sponsorship system, which ties their residency status to their employers. Reports of unpaid wages, passport confiscation, and physical abuse are widespread, with workers having little recourse due to the restrictive legal framework. Additionally, racial discrimination against non-Arab residents is common, with people of African descent often facing prejudice in both social and professional settings. Although reforms have been promised, meaningful change has been slow, leaving many foreign workers vulnerable to exploitation and racism in 2024. 7. Brazil. Brazil, often celebrated for its racial diversity, struggles with profound racial inequalities that disproportionately affect its Afro-Brazilian population. Despite making up a significant portion of the population, Afro-Brazilians face higher levels of poverty, violence, and discrimination compared to their white counterparts. The police violence directed towards Black Brazilians, particularly in favelas, slums, is a major issue, with many accusing law enforcement of racial profiling and excessive force. Additionally, Afro-Brazilians are underrepresented in higher education and professional fields, further perpetuating the cycle of poverty and marginalization. While there are affirmative action policies in place, they have not been sufficient to overcome centuries of entrenched racism. 6. Australia. Australia's history of racism, particularly towards its indigenous population, continues to cast a long shadow in 2024. Indigenous Australians face significant disadvantages in terms of health, education, and employment outcomes, a direct result of systemic racism and the country's colonial past. Racism also extends to immigrants, particularly those from Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, who often face discrimination in the workplace, housing, and society at large. Anti-immigrant sentiment, fueled by political rhetoric and media, contributes to a hostile environment for non-white Australians. Moreover, the treatment of asylum seekers and refugees, many of whom are detained in offshore facilities under harsh conditions, has drawn international condemnation. While Australia promotes itself as a multicultural society, racism remains a persistent issue that affects many lives in 2024. 5. Russia. Racism in Russia remains a significant issue, especially towards people from the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Africa. Ethnic minorities often face discrimination in employment, housing, and public services. The Russian government has been criticized for not doing enough to combat racist violence, particularly against migrants from Central Asia, who are often targets of xenophobic attacks. These migrants, who primarily come from former Soviet republics, face harsh working conditions and are frequently scapegoated for social and economic problems. Additionally, far-right nationalist groups in Russia have been involved in violent attacks against non-Slavic individuals, including people from Africa, the Middle East, and East Asia. Despite some governmental efforts to curb hate crimes, racial discrimination remains widespread, and societal attitudes towards ethnic minorities are often hostile in 2024. 4. China. China faces widespread criticism for its treatment of ethnic minorities, most notably the Uyghur Muslims in the Xinjiang region. The Chinese government has been accused of human rights violations, including mass detentions, forced labor, and cultural suppression of Uyghurs, which some international observers have described as genocide. Similar issues are faced by Tibetans and Mongolians, whose cultures and languages are being systematically marginalized. In addition, racism against Black people, particularly African students and expatriates, has been documented with incidents of discrimination, violence, and exclusion. The COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated these tensions, as African residents in Guangzhou were subjected to forced quarantines and evictions, highlighting the deep-seated racial prejudices in Chinese society. The government's tight control over media and civil society makes it difficult to address or even acknowledge these issues, allowing racism to persist in 2024. 3. United States. The United States remains deeply divided by race in 2024, with systemic racism continuing to affect numerous aspects of life for minority communities. African Americans, in particular, face disproportionate levels of police brutality, incarceration, and economic inequality, issues that have been highlighted by movements such as Black Lives Matter. The racial wealth gap remains stark, with white households holding significantly more wealth than Black and Latino households. Additionally, the rise of white nationalist groups and racially motivated violence has exacerbated tensions. The U.S. also struggles with discrimination against Latino, Asian, and indigenous populations, who face issues ranging from immigration crackdowns to hate crimes. While there are ongoing efforts to address these challenges, racism remains a pervasive problem in American society. 2. South Africa. South Africa continues to grapple with the legacy of apartheid, a system that institutionalized racial discrimination until the early 1990s. Although apartheid officially ended in 1994, its effects are deeply entrenched in South African society. Economic disparities remain vast, with a significant portion of the country's wealth still concentrated in the hands of the white minority, while the Black majority faces high levels of poverty and unemployment. This economic imbalance fuels ongoing racial tensions. Xenophobia is another significant issue, particularly against immigrants from other African nations, who are often scapegoated for economic problems. Violent attacks against these immigrants, known as xenophobic riots, have become a recurring issue. Despite the country's progressive constitution and efforts to address these inequalities, South Africa remains divided along racial lines in 2024. 1. India. India's struggle with discrimination is deeply embedded in its social structure, where both caste-based and racial discrimination persist. The caste system, although legally abolished, still defines the lives of millions, particularly Dalits and Adivasis, who face severe social and economic exclusion. This discrimination often mirrors racial oppression, manifesting in violence, social ostracization, and limited access to opportunities. Additionally, racial discrimination is directed towards people from northeastern India, who are often subjected to derogatory remarks and exclusion due to their distinct physical features. Furthermore, communal tensions between Hindus and Muslims exacerbate societal divides, leading to frequent outbursts of violence and discrimination.